are statements by the Council and the Commission on the conclusions of the informal European Council of the 23rd of September. I would be giving the floor to the President of the Council, but I think he's still on his way to the plenary chamber. Would you like to start? Don't trigger any diplomatic crises, please, Mr. Juncker. Well, I think he'll be here in a few seconds.
Herr Juncker, stimmt es eigentlich, dass...
Mr. Juncker, were you sitting in this seat this morning? Is that true? Mr. Juncker. Well, I was elected to the European Parliament on 5 occasions, but fate had something else in store for me.
Ich traue mir das auch zu.
I think that's fair enough.
Auf Ihrem Platz zu sitzen.
Well, yes, I think I could sit in your place as well, I reckon. Now, that's a parallel I don't think we should be drawing, actually. Okay, Mr. Tusk is busy, so we'll start with the statement concerning the conclusions of the informal European Council by giving the floor to the President of the Commission. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Well, I think it is good for the Commission to take the floor on behalf of the Council. And that is something I'd be quite happy to do as well. Once again, fate had something else in store. President, on the 23rd of September last, we had a meeting of the Informal Council to look at the issue of migration, and we wanted to make headway. And I think you will remember very well the Commission back in May put forward some proposals to the Council. The Council took a while to reach agreement on these proposals. We would have preferred it as the Commission if the Council, including the Internal Affairs Ministers, could have agreed on a share out of the asylum seekers after a fashion of solidarity, but given the political vicissitudes, this was not possible. And that's not a disaster, and we looked to the European treaties, looked at what is clearly marked there, and recalled what is set out there. As we've always said in this House, we wanted to apply the community method, and with a majority in the JHA Council, we decided there. In institutional point of view, this, I think, constitutes a very positive development, and I would reverentially greet the President of the Council. Would you like to take the floor, or may I continue? Okay, thank you. So I'm very moved by the affection shown by the Council. I'm very grateful for that. So they would have preferred a decision by unanimity. That didn't work, therefore the community method was applied, and I think that's absolutely good and proper. I don't think we should be drawn into the mudslinging and finger-pointing that may have been entered into. We've reached a decision. The decision will be implemented, and we will do that with the due expediency. In French, there was a council on the 23rd of September, and we put it to the two arms of the budgetary authority, the points that we had for 2015 and what we'll do in 2016 is something we'll be looking at in the coming weeks. We suggested 800 million to the two arms of the budgetary authority, and I'm very pleased that the European Parliament, in English,
fait savoir
once again decided very quickly. I think the committee was on the 8th, Parliament on the 15th, and Parliament really has shown itself up to the task of what we face in common. The European Parliament's given its green light for a fair distribution of refugees, which has really forced the hand of the Council to do the same thing. Can you imagine just for a second that the European Council could have cancelled the decision taken already by the European Parliament? So I'm extremely grateful to you, President, and to the members of this Parliament for having reacted so quickly, something that I think really characterizes this Parliament. You do that on budgetary issues as well, because it's certainly an issue of raising the resources for Frontex, for Europol, and for the Common European Asylum Office. Member States and the Commission will be appointing a good 600 officials to help Greece in protecting their external borders. And in deploying such a large number of staff in Greece, we are in fact doubling the number of officials working in DG Home, as it's called, the Internal and Justice Affairs DG. And I would encourage the member states who haven't already done this to do what the Austrians have done, what the Germans have done, and indeed others. We have seen President Tusk, yourself, myself. We met Mr. Erdogan, President of the Turkish Republic. Turkey is undertaking a considerable effort. They have 2.2 million refugees on Turkish territory from Iraq and Syria, most notably, and it is clear that we need Turkey to help protect our external borders, and the Commission will do its utmost to provide succor to the considerable efforts of the Turkish Republic in this issue. We cannot solely look inwards. We need to make sure that we look to the issues that should concern us on the peripheral of Europe. It's the same issue, and Turkey and the European Union need to walk together this path, and we need to look at reception, we need to look at processing and providing help to those unfortunate people who come to our shores. I put some points to the Turkish President in form of a memorandum on an agreement between the President of Council, President of Parliament, President of the Commission on issues concerning refugees and migration. This is a document that will be made public at 3 p.m. this afternoon, which is why I cannot reveal the details at the moment. We did agree with our Turkish friends that we would do it at 3 p.m. And we are certainly looking at concentrating towards on Greece. The 66,000 asylum seekers in Greece need to be spread amongst the member states of the European Union, and I've delegated to Athens, to the Directorate General responsible for structural reform in Greece, Mr. Veven, who is negotiating on the ground on the programs that need to be implemented by Greece. I've done that for Turkey, and high-level officials from the Commission will be negotiating with Ankara as of tomorrow the way in which we're going to approach this. And I've also asked the Commissioner responsible, there are actually several of them, Frans Timmermans, who maybe isn't aware yet, he's off to Turkey to negotiate on a political level with the Turkish ministers on the actual issues that we want to see concluded with the Turkish authorities. This common policy between the European Union and Turkey is not something that only concerns officials and high officials, even if they are extremely competent. We need to take this to a political level in a genuine and diplomatic sense of the word, both in the European Union and in Turkey. These policies come with a price tag, of course. And I note, I'm not worried, but I note with interest where we are in Europe and how we're going to deal with the costs that are going to accrue, and see how this will fall in with the interpretation of the Stability and Growth Pact, a pact which we have an economic aspect to, which I think will of course be important to look at, but I don't think we can just spend money without taking responsibility for how that is to be done. Now, maybe there's an ad hoc approach where certain countries would be able to apply aspects of this, but let us not assume things about the Stability and Growth Pact. Let's not take this lightly. We're looking at policy concerning refugees. Of course, we're open to discuss the way that this is to be approached financially. We're not open to any old approach, but we're certainly open to any suggestions that might be forthcoming. So, President, I'm quite happy to field any questions that you may have, and I will certainly be very attentive in listening to the President of Council, who I welcome here with us.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kommissionspräsident.
Thank you, President. President in Office of the Council now, Donald Tusk.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear friends, the real test for any community comes in a time of crisis. Just like we check our banks using stress tests, today life itself is using a dramatic migration stress test to check our community. And that is what the last European Council was about. You know its results. Allow me then to share a more general thought with you, especially that in 10 days the next European Council will be dealing with the same problem. Historical changes and threats on a large scale demand a sense of dignity and self-belief from every community, particularly now, when the whole world is focusing its attention on Europe and on its reaction to the wave of refugees. Europe is subject to an increasingly more scathing criticism, and our internal disagreements and mutual recriminations only help our opponents. Almost everyone in Europe has joined the choir of critics, while very few defend its good name. In the United Nations, one could have an impression that Europe is the worst place in the world for refugees. Believe me, I felt isolated there when I defended Europe's good reputation, trying to convince the audience that the truth about Europe is completely different. Hundreds of thousands of refugees go to Europe because they know that our community is still the most open and tolerant of all. It is still us who respect international standards and conventions. And it is Europe where people, all people, are safer than anywhere else. Let us not let Europe become a scapegoat due to our quarreling and blaming each other with no restraint. Otherwise, before long, theocracies will start to lecture us what religious tolerance means, dictators will tell us what democracy means, and those who are responsible for this massive exodus will tell us how to treat refugees. In fact, they are already doing this. There are countries which virtually do not admit any refugees, but are most vocal when it comes to urging Europe to show more openness. That is why we have to take care of our good name together. Dear members, we keep talking about solidarity, about quotas and greater assistance for refugees on our soil and for those who remain in camps and countries outside the EU. Let's remember, however, that solidarity requires mutual understanding and respect. Without solidarity among member states, we will not be able to help others. It is our common obligation to assist refugees as well as to protect the EU's external borders. Everyone must take up this obligation, and at the same time, no one should be left alone with the burden. That is how I understand solidarity. We have to respect commonly agreed rules. When someone says that they have no intention of observing European law, for example Dublin or quotas, they undermine the essence of solidarity and our community. Observing rules will always mean sacrificing part of our interests. I would like to dedicate these words to the Hungarians and the Italians, to the Slovaks and the Greeks. Let us have no illusions. Today, we have to count mainly on ourselves. The world around us does not intend to help Europe. Many of our neighbours have much bigger problems to tackle, and some look with satisfaction at our troubles. For us, refugees are specific people, individuals, who expect our help. There are forces around us, however, for whom the wave of refugees is just dirty business or political bargaining chip. We are slowly becoming witnesses to the birth of a new form of political pressure, and some even call it a kind of a new hybrid war, in which migratory waves have become a tool, a weapon against neighbours. This requires particular sensitivity and responsibility on our side. Dear colleagues, you all know the notion of ethics of responsibility from the works of Weber, not Manfred, but Max Weber. Today, the ethics of responsibility requires us to refrain from extremes. And by extremes, I mean both anti-immigration rhetoric on one hand, and on the other, inviting everyone willing to come, despite being unable to take them under our roof. We finally have to understand it. Today, millions of potential refugees and migrants are dreaming about Europe, not only from Syria, but also from Africa, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and other places. For all refugees, easy access to Europe and lack of external borders have become, besides the Willkommenpolitik, a magnet attracting them to us. During my visits to the region, whoever I spoke to, presidents or refugees in the camps, in Turkey, Jordan or Egypt, warned me against one thing: a potential victory of Assad's regime, more likely today because of Iran and Russia's engagement in Syria, will result in the next migratory wave. Yesterday, this message was confirmed by President Erdogan. According to Turkish estimates, another 3 million potential refugees may come from Aleppo and its neighbourhood. Dear members, declaring solidarity is always greeted with applause, while calling for responsibility and common sense, hardly ever. Practicing solidarity is a lot harder than preaching it. I am speaking as a decades-long practitioner. This is why I ask you all to show responsibility and common sense. The first commandment today is the restoration of control on the EU's external borders as a condition sine qua non of an effective humanitarian and safe migratory policy. Tomorrow, in the European Parliament, you will hear Angela Merkel and François Hollande. We all know how much depends on them. In this crisis situation, they have both demonstrated beautiful moral gestures, which we all highly appreciate. Tomorrow, they must pass an even harder exam, an exam in responsibility for the protection of the European community and its external borders. Otherwise, they and all of us will become responsible for the re-emergence of walls and barriers on our internal borders, here in Europe. We have to finally say it loud and clear. Europe without its external borders equals Europe without Schengen. Europe without its external borders will become a breeding ground for fear in each and every one of us. And this will lead us, sooner than later, to a political catastrophe. What ordinary people expect from politicians is, first and foremost, effectiveness and determination. If the leaders of mainstream politics do not realize this, people will start to look for different kinds of leadership, radical and ruthless. Because what people want from their leaders above all is the guarantee of order and security for their own community. Either we will face up to that challenge, or others will take our place. The queue of political machos is quite long, but there's still time to stop them, and that depends entirely on us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tusk. I will now give the floor to Mr. Weber, leader of the EPP. President, colleagues, I would like to begin by thanking the Council President for his presence. It is the first time that after an informal summit, the Council President has come to debate the issues with the European Parliament, and I would like to expressly thank him. People are feeling uncertain in the light of the migration crisis. On behalf of the EPP, I would say that we need to show people that we are in a position to come up with the answers. 3/4 of a year ago, we would not have considered ships patrolling the Mediterranean, British, German, Italian ships saving lives in the Mediterranean. 6 months ago, would we have considered that we could introduce a redistribution mechanism for 160,000 refugees, practicing solidarity? Who would have considered that in autumn we will begin a robust mandate in the Mediterranean so that we can fight the smuggling rings, not let them set the agenda, take the helm as member states? Who would have thought that at the most recent European Council we could come up with considerably more funding to help the United Nations and ensure that help is provided on the ground? It is important that we talk about success stories, not just the problems. We need to ensure that people are reassured that their leaders can grasp this problem. On behalf of my group, I would say that we don't need new ideas. What we need to do is to implement existing ideas. That is what is sorely lacking. The Commission has come forward with a package. It is heading in the right direction. And the European Parliament has provided clear backing to the package, yes, to hotspots, assistance on external borders, yes, returns. 2/3 of all refugees were rejected last year, so we need returns policy. We need action, not words. Yes, we need a list of safe countries of origin. We need to work with third countries. Action, not words. Implementation. Perhaps I could say a few words about Turkey. You met with President Erdogan yesterday. We support Turkey being defined as a safe country of origin. We want joint action along the borders to ensure security, and we want to step up efforts there. I would also say that we would remind President Erdogan and the Turkish Republic of principles. This is a candidate country and we expect human rights, civilian rights to be respected within the Turkish territory. We expect Turkey to deal properly and responsibly with the Kurdish issue. We cannot turn a blind eye just because we need Turkey as a partner on this front. Ladies and gentlemen, we are facing huge challenges, and that means that we need to focus on humanity, on people. Europe is a continent of humanitarian principles, as enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. We are proud of our fundamental values. I would remind you of what Angela Merkel said. We can be successful as a great continent. So refugees are welcome, but they face a challenge too. They cannot decide, pick and choose which member state they go to. They are duty-bound to be registered, to integrate into our societies. We need to make that clear to the people arriving on our shores. Another point, we need rule of law. We need legislation to be enforced. I am pleased that you talked about external checks on our borders and returns where necessary. We need the right technical measures to be deployed. We need to apply the law. We need to be in a position to provide the right conditions, so we need the right framework conditions in place so that our citizens can be reassured. So nothing new, we need implementation. That's what's important. Thank you. On behalf of the S&D Group, Mr. Pittella.
Grazie Presidente. Sì.
Thank you, President. Yes, Mr. Weber is correct. Few would have believed that we would be where we are today. But amongst the few figure we, the EP, the Commission. Because we said that in spring, actually, just what's happened now. And we saw it coming to pass in September. That's quite fast. The European institutions have to react swiftly and decisively. Let's make progress. Let's defend our area. I want to be a European, a champion of human rights. I don't want to change our true nature into the nature of a savage type of bear who wants to savage others. No, I agree with Mr. Tusk. What about relocation? Fine. Defending outside borders? Fine. Linking security and hosting? Fine. I think what the European institutions are doing with respect to Turkey and Lebanon, all that's fine. I'm sure it will happen. It will become deed. Let's not point fingers and say some countries are responsible, others are not. Others have been shouldering burdens and others not. Let's finish off with the negative expressions. Because negative expression just shows that we can't manage the situation, really. Barbed wire, walls, egotism, hatred, that's all negative and shows that we cannot manage and resolve problems. Problems are resolved if you're positive. Let's finish the stage of negativism and open up a new stage so that we don't endanger the soul or indeed the future of Europe.
Thank you, Mr. Pittella. On behalf of the ECR group, Mr. LEGUTKO.
Thank you. The UN High Commissioner said that 8,000 immigrants come to Europe every day. Mr. Tusk mentioned 1.1 million in the coming months. If those numbers are at least partly correct, it is clear that what the Commission and the Council have prepared for us is far from satisfactory. It's a stopgap. It is certainly not a solution. And as usual, we have had a confused and a confusing language, a traditional share of bullying and invectives against those who disagree. We have a disregard for laws that we have ourselves established. Humanitarian arguments were mixed with political. Mr. Timmermans, for example, went as far as to say that the relocation scheme is good for our souls. Amazing, you really did say that. We had elements of blackmail and typical Euro casuistry. The immigrants were invited and then disinvited. The Schengen procedures were abolished and then restored again. If this gigantic confusion is a reflection of the state the EU is in, then God help us. What we did not have, however, I think, is the long-term objective. What is the final state of affairs that we want to attain? The Council talked about the cultural and social criteria that are to be taken into account in the immigration policies. I think this makes sense. I'm afraid, however, that the Europeans have built such a powerful system of taboos and inhibitions around the immigration question that there is not much hope for a rational debate. My safe prediction is that we will have more and more of the same.
On behalf of the ALDE group, Mr. Verhofstadt.
Yeah, thank you very much, President. So let me say it bluntly, Mr. Tusk, I'm more and more fed up with the Council, not with you personally, be assured about that, but with the institution that you are representing. And why I'm saying this, because it has taken, first of all, a very long time before an informal summit has been organized, because this crisis is didn't start a few days or a few weeks ago. But then what the production was of this summit, one page, a statement of one page. This is the production of an informal summit of the European Council on the most important crisis Europe is facing the last decade. A refugee crisis as we have never seen before. One page, mainly in fact repeating decisions that already have been taken by the Interior Minister on the 120,000 refugees, and then also pledging for €1 billion of additional money. And I'm asking myself, colleagues, how many people from Syria have to die and how many additional people from Syria have to flee to Europe before the European Council is taking a comprehensive global approach on this refugee crisis, as by the way the Commission has proposed, because it's not that you have nothing on your plate. A few hours before the European Council, the European Commission have decided on a global package, including a new European asylum system not longer based on Dublin, including a new European migration package in which we create one system in Europe, not 28 systems, a blue card system, including what maybe is the most important, a European border and coast guard proposal that, by the way, Mr. Tusk, the Ministers of Interior on the 11th of September have refused to put in their conclusions, have not talked about it. So I'm asking what is needed, why it is not possible that this European Council in a summit is deciding on the package proposed by the European Commission, as the Parliament has already backed it. So that is my question. What is happening? Why this European Council cannot overcome these divisions inside. And my proposal is very clear, Mr. President, that is that we should agree, Council and Parliament, to give a fast-track procedure to the proposals of the Commission, the fastest as possible, as they are there. And then secondly, my proposal is on the outside borders of Europe. This conflict in Syria, is it not time really that the European Union, you, European Council, you as Mr. Tusk and Mrs. Mogherini, is taking an initiative? We are for the moment pushing out. Russians are taking action. What they are doing mainly is bombing. Bombing civilians, citizens in Syria, and the last remaining, I should say, free Syrian armed fighters. I don't know if it are many, but they are killed for the moment by bombs of the Russians. So I think, is it not time? We have the consequences. It's not the Russians who have the consequences of this refugee crisis. It are not the Americans. They are talking about Syria. And we will have all the consequences of it. We don't take an initiative on the European level for the moment. We have even 3 different opinions inside the Council about it. So take an initiative, a summit, 28 bilateral meetings, giving Mrs. Mogherini full mandate, and forcing also non-fly safe zones. Because it's crazy. I hear people who are saying, yeah, but that's not possible. You need for that a mandate of the UN. No, to bomb Syrian citizens, you don't need a mandate of the UN. But to protect Syrian citizens, you need a mandate. It's completely crazy, such an approach. And finally, we need also a new donor conference. There is not enough money in these refugee camps. So, Mr. Tusk, I count on you. It are not 28 heads of state who are going to solve these problems. They are not capable to do so. They are representing only a nation. You are representing a continent. Take your responsibility.
Thank you. On behalf of the GUI group, Mr. Iglesias.
Herr Iglesias?
Mr. Iglesias?
Ist nicht da. Okay.
He's not here.
Das Wort jetzt für die Fraktion. Bitte sehr. Ich dachte, Sie hießen Blanco.
I thought your name was Mr. Blanco.
Bitte, Herr Blanco.
Go ahead, sir. President, a member of the European Parliament is duty-bound to be present in the plenary chamber during this debate. I regret the fact that Mr. Iglesias is not present here for this debate.
No.
He may arrive shortly. Now, on behalf of the Greens, Mr. Lamberts.
Monsieur le Président Tusk, je vous ai écouté.
President Tusk, I listened to you very attentively, and you're absolutely right. I think you're right, because as Europeans, we have to be proud of what we have done in building Europe. You're right. And it's true, the European Union isn't perfect. State under the rule of law is still a work in progress. Our democracies sometimes aren't fully fledged, and our prosperity is maybe split somewhat. But I would always choose to live here, without a shadow of a doubt. And maybe it's not so surprising then that many refugees and asylum seekers choose to come to Europe as well. And you're right, you have the theocracies which tell us about religious tolerance. Dictators shouldn't be giving us lessons in democracy, and people who don't take in any refugees at all can't really give us lessons. But the countries you're referring to, President Tusk, mainly are allies of the European Union. And I would like to hear you tell those states what you've just told us here. When you saw Mr. Erdogan yesterday, it seems we need him, at a time when he puts under his boot either the press or other critics, then I note that this is not a subject that's raised. And I would call for a degree of modesty from your part on that, even if you are right that we should be proud as Europeans. You also said we should avoid extremes. Once again, I agree with you. Well, maybe I can quote you a couple of figures. The EU has 23.7% of world GNI. The 160,000 refugees that you in the Council has decided to resettle constitutes 0.2% of world refugees. So if we're looking at extremes, then I don't think it's an extremity of having flung our doors open. I think the European Union can do better. And I would call on you to follow the Commission's recommendations. We heard President Juncker, Vice President Timmermans on several occasions from their pulpits here to ask you to have a permanent distribution key for asylum seekers and refugees. I've heard them say there be legal routes of migration to accede to the European Union rather than allowing people to die on the way. We want to have a European process of asylum processing. So the Council is doing some good things, but you have to carry on fighting that good fight, and I encourage you to do that. Thank you.
EFDD.
On behalf of the EFDD, Mr. Castaldo.
Grazie.
Thank you, President. Well, speaking frankly, having heard some of the outcome of the informal council, I'm just amazed. My jaw dropped. I don't know what world we're living in with these migrants, thousands of dead. We've got a mountain labouring giving forth a mouse. A few thousand being actually shared out, and you seem to underestimate the huge cost in travel, lives, difficulty of these people coming. And we're enjoying a wonderful standard of life. These people are really in distress. Some people, well, a lot of people try and get round this, don't recognise it, they don't register them, they use razor wire, all sorts of methods, and other people just say, no, you can't come in. It's a sign of an internal crisis. There's a wall in Budapest, says the speaker, separating Hungary from its neighbour. That gives rise to internal barriers. That's what it is. And that threatens the stability and solidarity of us all. And the whole thing is being sacrificed on the altar of elections coming up. And when you talk about Turkey and say, well, we've got to smooge up to them and forget about the suffering of the Kurds, well, where are we? We're setting up walls after walls after walls. There are possible changes. Let's have special humanitarian corridors. Let's have a way of dealing with illegals. Let's look at reviewing Dublin. How long is that going to take? We've got to stop our trade oppression. We've got to deal with climate change. We've got to take consistent, courageous choices, not just any old thing. It's got to be done in a well-conceived fashion. That is where our reputation lies, Mr. Tusk. But when, oh God, when?
On behalf of the ENF, Mr. Alliot. President, thank you. Colleagues, it took a few weeks and a terrible photo for the European bureaucracy to come up with this drop in the ocean to tackle the refugee crisis. Yes, we need to provide assistance to those countries on the front line, our Italian and Hungarian friends, but let's stop stigmatizing Mr. Orban and Hungary, who is doing its best in the face of a crisis. You may remember that in 1956, Austria welcomed thousands of refugees fleeing communism. Europe was not in a position to take any decision there. We are dealing with the consequences of your past mistakes, your blind obedience to Mr. Bush in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Egypt. We have seen horrendous crimes, innocent people losing their lives day in, day out. Your system is paralysed. It is stifled. As General de Gaulle pointed out, we can only see truth and reality in the nations, trust in nations and their sovereignty. Thank you. On behalf of the non-attached members, Mr. Papadakis.
Thank you, President. The European Council conclusions mean that Europe has decided that a large number of refugees and migrants should stay at the war front lines that have been caused by NATO, by the United States and other imperial powers through their competition between them, and also the big businesses. Those refugees who manage to go through the traffickers and reach the sorting out centers are being selected, and only those who are interesting for the capitalist markets are being held in Europe. The others will be repressed or deported. On the same time, we have the Dublin regulation and other repression mechanisms in Europe being reinforced. Rapid intervention forces, etc., are leading into more and more people dying at the frontiers in Greece and other countries. So the Greek Communist Party is asking the people to show solidarity towards the refugees and migrants and to fight against the European Union policy. Refugees and migrants should be transported from their points of entry to their final destination by the European Union and the United Nations. Thank you.
On behalf of EPP, Mr. González Pons.
Huge movements of populace is going to be a problem for us over the next 20 years, so we do need a common migration policy and asylum policy. First of all, for looking to these people and a legal immigration system for Europe to assure external security of our borders. But the problem is the internal frontiers and the solidarity between member states, guaranteeing cooperation of transit countries such as Turkey. And also we need to allow that anybody who comes in are identified and also sent to identified hosts, because it's only that way that we can guarantee security for all. A common policy is going to be difficult because not just Syria. Behind Syria there are refugees lining up from all sorts of places. So winter's coming on, as Mr. Timmermans said the other day, and a lot of roads are going to be closed. We're going to have less migration, less refugees, because they won't be able to cross the seas. And maybe that'll mean this disappears from the press. And if you look at TV and it's not there, you might think there are no more refugees. That's a huge problem. It's a big mistake. We shouldn't displace this problem because it'll make it worse next spring. So, Mr. Tusk, we've got to make sure that member states do what they're supposed to do. If we know what we're supposed to do, then the time has now come to do it. Let's put on our trousers and walk.
On behalf of the S&D Group, Ms. Fajon.
Thank you very much, Chair. It took hundreds of thousands of refugees in Europe and a number of deaths for Europe to wake up. The agreement on the relocation adopted in Brussels and other measures are a positive signal, but I believe that the current situation is an important test. It is not a test for the very existence of the EU, but for its future development, for the new direction the EU will have to find to remain a competitive and attractive area. The coming months will show how member states will face migratory challenges in practice. It will become clear which member states comply with the fundamental principles of European integration and which member states are in search of a quick profit. I visited the collection and retention centers in Slovenia. Slovenia is well prepared and has provided care for the migrants. Fact is that Europe will be faced with changes in the coming years, but the migrants will not be the cause of these changes. Quite the contrary. I believe that migrants can mitigate demographic change if we can manage migration properly. It took binding measures for solidarity to occur. We do not want to re-establish the borders between our countries. Slovenian people do not want to wake up by offense, as has happened a few days ago at the border with Hungary. Apparently this was an experiment, but it gave rise to some bitter feelings. We do not need new disagreements and tensions in the Western Balkans, which we have seen in the past weeks. Combat and the closures of borders have caused great economic damage and caused fear among people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fajon. Mr. Seeler for the ECR Group.
Prezident kungs, gribētu pateikties padomes prezidentam Tusk kungam par atklāto valodu, par jauno politiku.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the President of the European Council for your very open speech. We see this sort of hybrid war that's going on from third countries, and we know that we need to look at reinforcing external borders. The European Commission's proposal is looking at having a share out of quotas and binding quotas. I think is something that many citizens see as suspicious, and there's certainly a split in society here. Refugees aren't satisfied either, because any secondary movements within the European Union are not really assured, which leads to discrimination. I'd like to get a reply from the Commission's President on a question of democracy, and I think we need to see a speedy resolution to the current situation in Catalonia, and the Commission's response there.
Continue debate now. Ska Keller, 1 minute.
Danke, wir sollen also über die Erfolge reden.
Thank you. We should talk about success stories, okay, but let's look at the facts. 160,000 refugees, and we're still 8,000 short, and a bit more money for the UNHCR. The UNHCR has been clamouring for more funding for years, so we are talking about very small success stories. Where are the Council decisions on legal channels for refugees and migrants so that they are not left to the mercy of traffickers? What about root and branch reform of the Dublin regulation rather than just tinkering about with the system? Member States instead seem determined to shove the problem on to other countries, other regions. The problem is that we are about to enter in a very dangerous pact with Turkey. The deal would be that Erdogan will deal with refugees, and in return he will not be criticised on his policy when it comes to the Kurds and press freedom. That is not the type of Europe that we can be proud of. Thank you.
Onorevole Pascas.
Pascas, 1 minute now.
Mr. President, colleagues, urgent support of billions of euros, will it solve the crisis? I don't think so. So far, the people of Europe do not see any concrete results that would help fight the root causes of the problem. When we fight the consequences, it means that the relocation system of refugees is not what we need. We need to take better care of our external borders. Whereas those countries who are trying to protect the external borders are called enemies of the European Union, this is direct intervention into the sovereignty and independence of those countries. Waves of refugees is the beginning of a future crisis. We can fight this crisis properly if we are determined enough, if we are we've got strong principles. Europe does not own anyone. We are open to our guests, but those who are knocking on our doors and not those who are trying to climb over the window, we need to protect our home. Thank you.
Grazie. Onorevole Wilimsky, Pascas.
Wilimsky. Pascal, there's a blue card. There's Coburn. Coburn.
Also angesichts dieser Ratssitzung zeigt sich für mich schon, dass
Council meeting, we seem to see a further failure of the European Union. And we're just swamped by this refugee flood, and once again we're failing. The whole construct of the European Union is going. So first of all, you might say, well, we'll take everybody. Then you've got millions coming in because they say, okay, well, we can't take everybody. So a bit of a U-turn. And then you're talking about enforced quotas. So the problem with sovereignty, it's trodden underfoot. So now we're in a situation where the Greeks, where there's with the Turks, there's a certain amount of blackmail in the background here. So in order to solve this problem, we must fight Islamic State. The Russians, together with the United States, trying to fight it, but it looks as though it's just the Russians at the moment. So A, get rid of Islamic State, and then secure zones in North Africa or on the peninsula, the Turkish peninsula. So, I mean, we've got to protect people. We've got to have flanking measures. You can't allow everybody in. You can't just open the doors. The Greens or the Conservatives don't want this either. It just won't work.
Grazie. Onorevole
Thank you. So Gollnisch, 1 minute.
Le Conseil européen.
The European Council of the 23rd of September has agreed to take on 120,000 refugees who could be deemed political. They certainly are, a number of them, but I'm sure that's not the case for the overwhelming majority. I'd like to take this opportunity to speak to you about two genuine political refugees that Europe is refusing to grant asylum, and their cases are indisputable. We have Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden revealed the surveillance programs that the US has been carrying out, which are completely illegal. Edward Snowden got political asylum only in Moscow in 2013. Italy, Portugal, Spain, France closed their airspace to Evo Morales because Snowden might be on board. And then we have Julian Assange, who's a prisoner, foreign prisoner in an embassy of Ecuador in London. Scotland Yard is monitoring that day and night, which has cost the taxpayer £6 million. That is shameful. Shame on that Europe, that supine Europe. Freedom for Snowden, freedom for Assange.
Onorevole Olbricht.
Jan Olbricht, 1.5 minutes.
Panie Przewodniczący Rady, Panie Przewodniczący.
President, we're faced with a major challenge here in Europe. What you've said here and the way you presented the content of your presentation points out to the gravity of the situation. We MEPs understand that the situation is particularly difficult within the European Council. It is a message for us that there is a need to change something the way the European Union functions. The dramatic tone of your presentation clearly states that there is no way we can continue like that. My question to Mr. Tusk is the following. What is your point of view on the competence sharing issue? The member states, what they are supposed to be doing together and separately, for that matter. What is the task of the European Council? Whether those decisions which have been made are according or not to the treaty. This is a point in time where we need to call in a check on what we're doing, because the situation, as you seem to be pointing out, is very difficult.
Mr. Olbricht, there's a blue card for you from Atledge, please. Atledge, actually.
No, un momento. L'onorevole Etheridge.
Etheridge, the speaker corrects himself. Etheridge.
Thank you. You can see how keen we are on this side to ask a question. My question is very simple. I wonder if you could help me understand who are these people who are talking today and what has happened? Everyone's talking about changing. We must have external borders, we must have controls, we must make sure that we don't get overwhelmed with all these migrants coming in. Who are these people? Are they the same ones who have unfalteringly just voted through everything saying that we should allow more and more people to come here and encourage the flow? Do you think they're the same people? Could you help me to identify who on earth is talking today?
Onorevole Olbrycht.
Olbrycht, you can reply.
Panie pośle.
Distinguished colleague, I have no idea what these people are and who they are. We need to run a check. I can't provide you with a simple answer to that. Some of those people need to be stopped. We need to run a check and ascertain whether they are true and true refugees, and if not, they need to be sent back. Hope this satisfies you.
Enrique Guerrero.
Enrique Guerrero, 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much indeed. Last week I went to Lebanon and Jordan as part of a delegation of my political group and as standing rapporteur for the EP on humanitarian actions. We met with UN agencies for refugees, with with UNICEF, the Palestine Agency, and also civil society organizations, and all sorts of people, in particular the Speaker of the Lebanese Parliament. Also, we had access to the refugee camps in Baraneth, Bar and Santaри. In all those camps, there are 100,000, that's 2 camps in Lebanon, well, in Lebanon and 1 in Jordan, 100,000 refugees. The same sort of quantity of people we're talking about hosting in Europe. Now, the recommendations which I garnered in these meetings were as follows. First, that Europe should work and get involved in a solution for the war in Syria. And that involved Damascus. If the regime or stands or fails, it looks as though we're going to have millions of refugees who are going to come to the European coast. So that's looming anyway. And we've got to show solidarity with Lebanon and Jordan. If those countries collapse, that means that the situations of millions of refugees already there is going to collapse. They've taken refuge there, but where will they go then? Will we have a third intifada? That's brewing at the moment. We've got to show solidarity, real solidarity from the European Parliament and the European institutions. And then finally, we've got to deploy education to help children in refugee camps. Without education for those children, the parents will have no other choice than try to come to Europe. Thank you. Well, thank you. Mr. Guerrero, there is a question to you from Mr. Coburn. Would you accept? Please, you have the floor.
Microphone. Micro. How's that? Would you agree with me, Mr. Guerrero, that the European Union, would it not be better, rather than dragging people across Europe, wouldn't it not be better for the European Union to be persuading the Kuwaitis and the Saudis to build good, proper camps on the borders of Syria and Turkey? Wouldn't that be a sensible solution, rather than drag people across Europe, creating resentment and other problems? Surely that must be a better way of doing it. Would you agree with me, sir?
Honorable Guerrero.
Mr. Guerrero. Well, Mr. Coburn, there are not many things where I could even imagine being in agreement with you. But I want to tell you that what we discussed is what we should be doing. What other people do is up to them. The ball is in our court. It is incumbent on us. These refugees are coming to us, and it's we who have to find a solution. It's up to us.
Grazie. Onorevole Trebesius, per un minuto.
Trebesius, 1 minute, please.
A wave of migrants is flooding Europe. Germany alone is expecting 1.5 million migrants this year. This smashes all records to date. The situation has got completely out of control. At the JHA and summit meetings recently, we talked about quotas of 160,000 for Europe as a whole. What type of figures will we be discussing next week, next month? Mrs. Merkel has lost all grasp on reality. The municipalities cannot deal with the burden. The volunteers are seeing their limits reached. We can't just hand out balloons. We need to close down borders and send out a clear message to migrants that Europe cannot take in all comers. Most refugees need to go to regions managed by the UNHCR. We need to boost funding for the UNHCR. We need to make it clear that refugees are safe there and that they don't have a right to travel on to Europe.
Onorevole Trebesius.
Ulrike Trebesius, there's a question to you. I just remind colleagues, there's one blue card only per member. I think, Gerrit, you want to speak?
Non aveva chiesto. E allora prego.
Jaakonsaari.
Puhemies, te puhuitte.
President, you talked about natural forces, waves, and so I think we are talking about people, human beings, and I think we should thank Mrs. Merkel for owning this. They actually try to understand the situation and deal with it. They try to organize jobs, bank cards, and try to find apartments. Thank you.
Prego, la risposta, scusi.
Sorry, reply to that, yes. For Trebesius.
You say that we should be grateful to Mrs. Merkel, but Mrs. Merkel should perhaps have discussed the matter with her citizens first of all. She never asked Germans whether they agreed with her position, and I think that that's something that needs to be tackled.
Onorevole Lambert, per un minuto.
Jean Lambert, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Many people today have talked about solutions, but we know those are going to be long-term. And in the meantime, we have a situation we have to manage. So I welcome the increase in funding for UNHCR and the World Food Programme. But I think it's really shocking that so many member states last year cut their support for the World Food Programme, so that we are seeing people in the region living on half $1 a day. So those member states, particularly those that have not been willing to join in the Solidarity Programme, should really hang their heads in shame about what the additional suffering they're causing, and you have to ask whether you would stay if you were trying to live on that and support your family. I'd also agree with many of those who've spoken on Turkey. It's not a safe third country for Kurds, and we should be supporting the Kurds in the area of Rojava and in Turkey themselves, because they are part of the solution. And lastly, I think we have a challenge about putting into operation the decisions taken. And if we're talking about rules and making it clear to people there are rules, then can we make sure we have staff on the ground, information in relevant languages, and the asylum process starts at the moment of arrival, not a few days afterwards once people have been spoken to by Frontex and various other organisations. Thank you.
Grazie. Onorevole Lambert.
Thank you, Mrs. Lambert. There is a question to you from Grappini. Yes.
Onorevole, la sua domanda.
Please put your question to member.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte, mulțumesc, stimată colegă. Sigur că este o situație de urgență și cu toții suntem de acord.
Thank you. It is an urgent situation. Thank you. It is an urgent situation. Don't you think that member states in the Council should clearly explain how to resolve the causes so that Europeans can once again have trust and faith in the way which we host these people. I've not heard from the Commission and the Council how they're going to resolve the causes, the very source of all these problems.
Può rispondere.
A reply?
Thank you. I think that's a valid question. I think we're not hearing much about what's happening to establish peace on the ground, to actually deal with some of the other underlying issues, whether that's about the questions about democracy, questions about how we're tackling climate change in the region, which is certainly a contributory factor to the instability. And indeed, we're not really looking, as was raised earlier, at how we're having a consistent policy towards governments which actually oppress their own people and indeed are actually bombing their own people.
Grazie. La parola ora.
Thank you. 1 minute per Mach.
Já tady od vás všech, kteří
All of you are asking for reallocation of migrants, and you all think that you're morally superior. And you'll say how barbaric are those countries that refuse the quotas for migrants. But what sort of moral is it? You want to be moral at the expense of others. This is an enforced solidarity. It's not a real solidarity. First of all, you undermine the situation in Libya, in Syria, then you attract migrants to Europe, and then you want to redistribute them through a system of voting at the Council. You enforce the redistribution of migrants. But every action leads to a reaction, and I firmly believe that the election in Poland will lead to a government that will stand united with the Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary against those permanent quotas.
Onorevole Atkinson.
Janice Atkinson, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Tusk refers to all migrants as refugees. They're not. Some are, most aren't. They're economic migrants. Last Saturday, hundreds of migrants at Calais again tried to illegally enter the UK. With the risk of criminals and jihadi terrorists slipping across our porous borders, I fear the safety of the British people is at risk, yet again. According to Eurotunnel, we are now seeing left-wing British anarchists stirring up trouble in the migrant camps. Please, French authorities, do us all a favour and deal with them in your own unique way of crowd control. And while you're doing this, could I remind you that the migrants cutting the fences are criminals, the migrants breaking into lorries are criminals, and the migrants storming the tunnel are criminals. Why are the Calais authorities and the French government failing to stop this? They can do so under the Dublin Agreement by arresting, detaining and deporting. Hungary's Viktor Orban shows leadership by taking the appropriate measures. He's being a good European, entering into solidarity that is often so spoken about in this Parliament. Other countries should follow his example. The majority of the leaders in this place give out open invitations. Is it no wonder the migrants come? Mr. President, to end this crisis, it's crucial to start upholding the Dublin rules and to take full control of our borders back again. Thank you.
Monsieur Lamassoure, à vous la parole.
Mr. Lamassoure.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. President, we've seen what is happening. Even the most important member states, even those who've stayed outside Schengen, cannot manage the migratory problem. The solution that have been applied in panic here and there goes from the sublime to the ridiculous. Today, there are two mistakes we must not make. First of all, believing that the exodus coming to Europe is just from the civil war in Syria and will stop at its end. For years and years, from Africa, Middle East, from Asia, thousands of young men, sometimes whole families, try their hand to get here, sometimes risking their life. We saw Sicily as a destination. We saw the Canary Islands before then, Ceuta and Melilla as well. Migratory flows will be a permanent issue of our current century. Hope or despair really falls on these people who see no future in their home countries. The second error would be to see distribution of asylum seekers that's decided on in a painful fashion will solve the problem. We need to have a global policy of migration and asylum. We have to have an appropriate foreign policy, and that is something that Europe would do well to adopt. The Commission is right in starting by renewing the whole approach here, and the Council is committing an error by not carrying this through to its end.
Onorevole Guillaume.
Thank you, Sylvie Guilloume. 1.5 minutes.
Merci. Thank you. Everyone agrees that the Council on the 23rd of September and the JHA meeting enabled progress to be made, although it was painful progress to manage the refugee crisis. The response given needs to be part of a much longer-term, more comprehensive approach. We should not lose sight of the essential points. It is vital that we react quickly. That is needed to tackle this humanitarian crisis, but we also need to look to the medium and long term. And so I have a couple of questions to the Commission and Council. The migratory policy is becoming operational because it is urgent, but we need to look at the longer term. In other words, should we and can we better adopt the community approach to our measures? Now, this operational approach raises the whole issue of financing in the short, medium and long term, and there we need to consider the European budget. Do you think that we can continue to implement the policies with the current European Union budget? And finally, the external dimension. The idea is to determine who needs international protection and have them in third countries. So what will that lead to? European enclaves in third countries to identify worthy recipients. I'd be interested to hear your reply. Thank you.
Mrs. Guillaume, you've got a question. Winberg, please put your question.
Thank you very much. You and your party are in favour of forcing these 160,000 migrants to be shared out. So I'd like to put a question to you. Once these quotas are used up for the 160,000 migrants that have managed to cross the Mediterranean and risk their lives, there'll be 500,000 more that won't be covered by these quotas. What are you and your party going to do about that with those 500,000? Thank you.
Madame Guillaume.
Mrs. Guillaume, up to you.
Mrs. Winberg has attended a number of Libe committee meetings, and my group has always held firm in its position. We need urgent response to the current crisis, but we also need to look to the longer term, take a broader view. So we need to look at the root causes of these problems, the current difficulties. We need to work with the countries concerned. We also need to look at integration, and on all those scores we completely disagree, because you are not in favour of any integration.
Honorevole Sulik.
So Sulik, 1 minute. In summer, we calculate we have about 800,000 refugees. It's now, current calculation, 1.5 million. Now, if you subtract one from the other, it's all due, that difference, to Angela Merkel and her very destructive policies. She just set aside Dublin and has infringed the German Grundgesetz, the basic law. Most of the people who come are economic migrants. They are not fleeing from war. And they go through 4 or 5 safe countries. And if you do that, you're not fleeing from a war. It's an absolutely illusory to believe that these migrants are going to actually contribute to German pensions. And the German minimum wage is far too big a barrier for that. And what about allowances, social allowances? Mrs. Merkel forgot who elected her and who she should be protecting. It's time to wake up and stop this invasion. Australia really gives us a lesson.
Eva Joly, 1 minute.
Thank you, Eva Joly. 1 minute.
President, the European Union does not exist. The Union that I would like to see united, showing solidarity and generosity, does not exist. That is what I will retain from the pathetic summit on the 23rd of September. The European Parliament voted to an overwhelming majority for a provisional relocation mechanism. The President of the Commission and his team is working tirelessly to ensure solidarity, and member states must be worthy and shoulder their responsibilities rather than being petty and engaging in horse trading and threats. We know part of the solutions applied. We need courage. We need to show political will. In the wake of the Greece crisis, we now have the refugee crisis, and the answers are hollowing out the European dream. The member states, heads of state and government, are pushing European citizens into the arms of extremists. Let us ensure that the European Union becomes a sign of hope.
Mrs. Joly, there's a question for you. To cover your question, please.
Thank you, Madam Joly. You say that the European Union will never exist in the basis that you hope it will exist. And does that not underline the problem of this utopian fantasy? Does that not underline how the 28 EU member states, whether you people here like it or not, will always have their best national interests at heart? Do you agree with me that actually this is really, if you're being honest, a failed plan?
Onorevole Joly, prego.
Mrs. Joly.
The refugee crisis is a result of chaos around the world and our foreign policy, or rather lack of a foreign policy. We need to manage the immediate urgent difficulties. As my colleague pointed out, it is a real shame that member states have scaled down their development assistance and funding. The urgent humanitarian funds are running out. Their coffers are empty. The World Food Programme doesn't have any funding to feed people in camps. That is a real shame.
Vicky MAEIJER, 1 minute.
President, in a dictatorial way, Brussels has decided to reform the EU to one big asylum reception centre, and with the relocation of people trying their luck, they've opened the doors. Merkel's invitation hasn't been withdrawn. On the contrary, it's been pushed forward. 600,000 asylum seekers have already entered Europe illegally this year, and the only contribution that these so-called Syrian people have contributed to is an increase in fights and rapes. We can see that the European Union is not dealing with what is coming upon it. 66% of the Dutch people think that we shouldn't receive any more refugees. The majority of Germans are worried about the stream of migrants. Austrians are voting for the FP as well, and against mass immigration and stemming it. Enough is enough, President. We don't want to see any more asylum seekers here. We have to close the borders. That's the only way that we can stop this asylum tsunami.
Onorevole Maier.
Maier, there is actually a question for you from Urban Crespo. Please, please put your question now.
Llama la atención la ligereza con la.
Well, the cavalier nature in which we talk about tsunamis, impending plagues, invasion. What you are really generating is institutional racism and xenophobia on people who are fleeing bombs and poverty. And at the same time you're pressing austerity. But when it comes to solidarity, human rights and rest, well, you talk about a plague. So you can't have one and the other. You're trying to destroy European values and construct a Europe of xenophobia, are you not?
Yes.
Thank you, Mrs. Maier.
Ja, die commentaren over...
Well, the comments on racism and xenophobia are your opinion. Do you know where the Netherlands is? I can tell you it's not next to Turkey, it's not next to the Mediterranean. And if these asylum seekers are looking for safety, then there are at least 10 countries, safe countries, they could have gone to before arriving in the Netherlands. So they're not looking for safety, they're looking for free care and free food. And I think it is outrageous that you are allowing our own citizens to be saddled with this enormous disaster.
Onorevole KEFALOGIANNIS.
Manolis KEFALOGIANNIS, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Undoubtedly, the European Union has to receive a large number of refugees and migrants. This crisis is a European problem, and this is why we need a European solution to it based on the principle of solidarity, and we have to be responsible in that. So it is imperative to give support to those states at the front line, that is Italy, Greece, Malta. This is also why technical and financial support is needed for these states. It is also needed to provide financial support to the people who are receiving the refugees and migrants. There is this case of the baker in the island of Kos, who is the embodiment of the principles on which the European Union was founded. There are no simple solutions. We have to be proactive. We need to focus on the transit countries such as Turkey and also the countries of origin of these people. And also, at the operational level, we have to improve the border guard operations. We have to reinforce Frontex. The will is there, the ability is there. The European Union should find its way to face this crisis. I'm confident in your abilities, President Tusk and Juncker, and I'm confident that the European Union will do what it needs to do based on its history and principles. Thank you.
Mr.
KEFALOGIANNIS, there is a question to you from Vostovsky. Please, put your question.
Pytanie panu posłowi
I wanted to ask a question to Mr. Lamassoure, but I also would like to ask here whether the...
Mi scusi, siccome avevamo capito con I nostri servizi...
Sorry, our services had understood you want to put a question to KEFALOGIANNIS. I'm sorry. We said there's one blue card.
No.
Patrizia TOIA.
Col Consiglio di settembre...
No, the September Council is just starting this work, and we've looked at it very quickly. Hotspots, identification, quick processing of requests, location and repatriation. All these things are interlinked. And we want some sort of effective European solution which will actually respect the rights and sufferings of people. But Mr. Juncker, no question for the moment, but just say thank you for your determination and decisiveness. Continue along that path. President Tusk, with all due respect, I know you have a great deal of high responsibility, but we would like you to be more decisive and more incisive. You're guiding the Council, remember. Remind them of the responsibility to solidarity. You talked about it, but it hasn't existed. So make some steps forward in the Council. I must say, I didn't like the rather vague way, as King Solomon, you distributed responsibility. I know you mentioned Italy and Greece, but the various countries I don't want to refer to, but who've been building walls. And this is not part of Europe, the sort of thing that you've been rightly defending. People talked about the responsibility of Italy. We have decided when these people were either going to die or live, we saved them. They're all human beings, men, women and children.
Way per un minuto, prego.
Way for 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. The European Union was founded to put an end to centuries of war, national selfishness, bloody competition between European nations, and instead build a union based on common values, cooperation and solidarity. A European Union of 500 million people must be able to face this migration crisis, if it's a healthy union, of course. But of course this is an ill union, and if there is an illness, then it can be attacked by viruses, and there is a virus inside the European Union. This virus is the selfishness of political leaders who are trying to play their political games, domestic political games. Mr. Juncker, we agreed on things already before the summer, and you promised measures for September. Where are these measures? And of course Hungary is not only about Mr. Orban and his government. Hungary is much more. Hungary is also all these tens of thousands of civilians and volunteers who helped the migrants. Many of them are here in the chamber as guests. They are the future of Europe.
Onorevole Way.
Oui, a request from Morvai to put a question.
Újhelyi képviselőtársam Szegedről érkezett. Segítené-e az Európai Parlament döntéshozatalát a migráns válság vagy migrációs válság körében azzal, hogy ismerteti, hogy...
Mr. Újhelyi, you are from Szeged. Would you help the decision-making process of the EP on the migration issue by realizing the difficulties that people living around the border area, they have had a really hard time regarding the migration and the migrants arriving. I believe your local expertise would contribute a great deal to making the right decisions. Thank you.
Valóban, én
Indeed, for 12 years I was a member of the Hungarian parliament representing the town of Szeged and its surroundings, and this is indeed a hotspot in this migrant crisis. I live a few kilometers from where Mr. Orban and his government started to build a fence. And you know, Ms. Morvai, very well that the Hungarian society could have handled the problem very differently if it hadn't been for the political campaign of Mr. Orban, and of course also your extreme right party. It's Fidesz and the extreme political forces who have tarnished the image of Hungary. Please, let's find our way back to solidarity.
Gomez, prego, un minuto.
Anna Gomez, 1 minute. President Tusk, Fortress Europe, we seem to want to bring up, is not going to protect us. Governments in the Council have been talking about this for some time. We should be talking about solidarity, not just refugee flows. So look to legal ways so that we don't continue to enrich traffickers and not just get involved in military ideological discussion because of crisis, Libya, Islamic State, and that sort of thing. What we've got to do is spend some money on that. Help educate young people in refugee camps. That's useful. We shouldn't just push nationalist forces which will fragment the European Union. We need a coordinated approach, not to infringe the values of Europe, and not talk about refugee tourism as an excuse to undermine our human values. We need synergies, coordinate our capacities, common policies. And it's not the sort of thing we're hearing from the Council at all. We need more union, not more administration.
C'è una domanda per lei.
Ms. Gomez, question from Weigelt. Will you accept it? Yes, Weigelt.
Distinguished colleague, we are dealing quite frequently with international problems. There is a lot of speculation why people are running away. Most people running away from violence and war. I think everybody should realize that, in particular when it comes to Syria. Don't you think that the moment has arisen when Europe should renew its obligation to maintain peace? Shouldn't Europe be more effective in advocating that international problems should be resolved peacefully? We have to give peace a chance.
Prego, onorevole Gomez.
You're right,
Anna Gomez.
my dear colleague, but that's exactly why I asked that in the European Council governments stop boycotting the common foreign and security policy and the common security and defense policy. We need them. We need to act strategically, and only coordinated can we make the difference, be it to end the war in Syria and not to make it worse, as it would be a victory of Assad, and to actually act in support of those who are on the ground fighting the Islamic State, for instance the Peshmerga in Iraq, in the northern Iraq, which we don't help at all, or we do it in a fragmented way, in a non-coordinated way, in this way, failing our own citizens. We are failing the security and defense of our own citizens by not addressing the root causes of what makes people flee, be it in Syria, be it in Eritrea and elsewhere.
Grazie. Ricordo ai colleghi che alla fine della mattinata ci saranno.
There will be votes at the end of this morning. After this debate there will be another debate, so please keep to your speaking times. Mavridis, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. There is a humanitarian problem, and this is primarily to save the people at sea, to save these lives. How can there be security and protection for those populations if we not combat ISIS, first of all? And this is also a question and a remark towards Mr. Tusk. Our conscience as Europeans implies that we need to help these refugees, but before that we need to make everything in our power to stop these refugees from becoming refugees, and first and foremost we have to combat ISIS. I'm against the Assad regime, of course, but it is a regime that is Turkey is a regime that is creating problems in Kurdistan, that is continuing the occupation in Cyprus, that is combating dissent, but we believe that we need to have them as a partners. At least let's ask them to stop the bombing of the Kurdish people. What makes us different in Europe is that we have the same principles as
Tonino Pizzua, 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Juncker, in presenting your program, you mentioned that the EU consists of 29 member states. The area of these 29 is by no means imaginary, since it is comprised of unemployed and deprived people of Europe. And today these unfortunate groups of people are joined by refugees. In the world of today, there are obviously no more local or regional crises. All of these have the potential of a global crisis, and this is clearly shown by the current crisis. The EU is internally divided on this problem. Only 5 member states accept around 70% of refugees. And this crisis has placed us under great pressure, thereby underlining how the EU institutions function well in ordinary circumstances, but react slowly and poorly to unexpected circumstances. Croatia is one member state exposed to waves of refugees, but not a part of the Schengen area, and instead of solidarity we're faced with political harassment, barbed wire and the militarization of borders on the part of another member state. So it all comes down to the question in what type of a society we wish to live in and what type of image do we want to send out into the world. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. There is a request for Mr. Pittella. Or not? No, okay. Now Pablo Iglesias, 2 minutes. You should have been speaking a little earlier, but better late.
Thank you, President. I heard about plagues, impatience, migration and terrorism, migration and security are all being conflated. I think that that is an insult to this chamber, to democracy. You are really trash if you are referring to humans in this way, people fleeing war. I believe that there is hypocrisy at play. The European foreign policy over the last 15 years has not helped to resolve the wars and crisis. Spending more money is not going to be enough. Now, the Dublin Protocol, if it had been done away with, I'm not sure that we would not still have seen images of death on beaches and problems in transit countries. I believe that we need to show less hypocrisy when dealing with all these insults and problems.
Iglesias, c'è una domanda per lei.
A question for you, Mr. Iglesias. Mr. Iglesias, a moment. There's a question for you from LeBreton. Will you take it?
Prego.
Merci d'accepter ma question. Chers collègues.
Well, thank you for accepting my question. Sir, I think talking about us as being trash, some of the people in this chamber, I think I'm somewhat taken aback by that. I think you cannot deny that this immigration is massive. It is really beyond what we could have feared. And it's not a question of racism and xenophobia to be worried about it. So I think if, above and beyond your insults, you don't believe that the member states have reason to worry about what's happening, and that we can understand that it's in the states' interest to reduce this flow of migrants. And maybe the European Union, I'm just wondering if you think the same, that the European Union should also stop this flow at the countries of origin, rather than waiting them to come here and sending out invites like Mrs. Merkel's done.
Iglesias.
Mr. Iglesias.
Are you European? And perhaps your forefathers, like mine, were unfortunate enough to have to leave their countries. And I would say that anyone who called our forefathers a scourge or a plague would be trash. I believe that this really is selfishness in describing countries, people rather, fleeing misery in this way. We need to do more to honour the democracies we are forging.
Prima di ascoltare in sede di replica.
Right. Before hearing the responses from Tusk and Juncker, we will go through the catch the eye procedure. There's so many people who have wanted to catch my eye, but it's not possible. Just one member per group, given the timetable which we're in. We have little time, so to start off, Bogovic, 1 minute. Please keep to it.
Dear colleagues, Europe does not need to take the responsibility for the whole migration crisis. Europe did not cause this crisis. Europe is a part of the solution to this problem. So Europe is not the patient. The situations are different in various member states, and these differences must be respected. And we must speak about this in our house as well. The crisis is the result of the fall of the regimes in various states. These regimes have been replaced by dictators who have no respect for history, for human life. That is the problem, and this is the problem that we need to face first of all. We need to provide order in these countries, and this is the only way to peace. We must know that the migration crisis will continue as a result of African demographics, so we need a long-lasting and sustainable solution. But first of all, we must take care of those who are on the European soil.
Thank you very much indeed. Now the first one from the S&D was you, Frida. 1 minute.
Subito dopo la decisione del Consiglio.
Immediately post the 23rd of September Council. It was a long time in coming and tough to get, but I wonder now how we can explain this to citizens, people who still believe in European values. Several times the European Parliament has said on a vast majority what it feels, and the approach which was finally achieved there can only be just if anything, a first step. We need strong, specific actions taken because the geopolitical changes are irreversible and those are generating the migratory flows. You cannot just put this off. But it seems as though we're going backwards here instead of going ahead in a decisive way. Everybody's got to put their thinking caps on now. We've got to really consider our position. Some countries are just saying no, no to everything. But we have to act. What President Juncker said, it's emphasized that in the European Union there's a lack of precisely that, union.
Un minuto anche per lei.
Marius, 1 minute for you too.
Mr. President, hundreds of thousands of refugees are coming into Europe through Greece. It is impossible for us to take this burden. We have more than 260 refugees coming through Greece already. So it is time to take measures. First of all, we need to take initiatives for the peaceful resolutions of conflicts in the Middle East and Africa. We need to address Turkey and tell them that it is time not to use refugees anymore as a political tool and combat trafficking. Dublin II, this regulation has to be revised. We have to look into the share out of refugees throughout all member states in the EU based on their income and their surface area. Countries like Greece need to be supported financially to take care of the external borders, and we need to admit that the safeguarding of external borders of Greece are exclusively Greek sovereign rights, and we will not be giving this right to Turkey or to the European Union. Thank you.
Bagadzao Tundur, sorry if I've mangled your name, but it's tough.
Señor Tusk.
Mr. Tusk, you are talking about defending the European Union and its reputation in the UN. What horrifies us is that all people, children, are dying on their way to Europe. We are seeing egoism, selfishness in this worry about the reputation of the European Union. The Parliament, the Commission need to do more. We have a plan in place, a proposal. Mr. Tusk, you need to do more. You failed at the Council at the summit. You talked about responsibility. Well, that's always what is invoked when we talk about very serious issues. We need solidarity, we need our values, and they are lacking at the external borders. Unfortunately, that is the case.
Thank you. Chrysogonos, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. We are discussing this issue once again in this House, and we are discussing the refugee crisis as if the fact that there are so many refugees is a natural phenomenon, like the sun or like the rain. Well, it's not a natural phenomenon, it's the result of war. And these wars have those who caused them. The war in Syria has been going on for 5 years now, and Western countries have a responsibility in this war, including some European member states as well. And why is that? Because these countries want to impose throughout the world the regimes of their choice. The West has been supporting Syrian opposition, trying to cause regime change against Assad. But this has failed and has strengthened the Islamic State. So we need to realize that it is impossible to find a solution in Syria without Assad. We need to combat the Islamic State, and this will reduce the number of refugees.
Ulrike, un minuto.
Ulrike Lunchik, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Presidents of the Council and Commission, ladies and gentlemen, I think it was a good decision on the 23rd of September to have a JHA Council deciding to distribute across the EU member states the asylum seekers. That is a good sign, a sign of solidarity. But now it has to be implemented. We need a coalition of humanity which will work for people, for the men, women and children who are fleeing the IS, fleeing Assad's bombs. That decision has to become reality. Merkel said it, we can cope. You know, we have to get rid of Dublin. We have to make sure that people have legal ways of getting here, not Frontex ships as prisons. I'm surprised that Mr. Erdogan is being brought on board as a hero and his downsides are ignored, the Kurds and abusing journalists, etc. You, Mr. Tusk, as President, we need to see you call on heads of state and government to have courage, not fear, to go against hate speak, regardless if they're from CSU, Fidesz, SPÖ or the Freedom Party.
Lindberg, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. I'm not sure. I'm actually quite shocked. It feels like this chamber is in a bubble. Has nobody actually seen what's going on out there in reality? You're talking here about solidarity. Well, for me, solidarity is when people are playing on my heartstrings, and World Food Programme is having to cut food to the people who need it. Now you can work out how this fits together. 1 + 1 = 2. The money that was meant to go to development is now going to mass immigration that we're seeing today in my country, Sweden. People talk about integration. The answer to my blue card question is that we should integrate everybody who comes to our shores. Well, Sweden have been doing that for many a long year, and it has never been successful. We have up to 200 areas which are marginalized. You have at least 50 no-go zones. We don't even have the housing. We don't have jobs for these people. So you can imagine that Sweden is now thinking about building its first asylum camp, and we have -20°C in winter.
The last speaker, Balzó.
Onorevole Balzó.
Balzó.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, President of the Commission, shows surprise that the interior ministers did not make a unanimous decision on the quotas, and adds that there are internal political reasons. Yes, that is the answer, but there are certain governments that take into account what citizens want. The French foreign minister, in unqualified terms, attacked the Hungarian government for defending the borders, but the majority of respondents actually agree with the erection of the fence, and Mr. Donald Tusk regards as the key challenge to defend the reputation of Europe. Europeans are the most tolerant and most democratic and welcoming society in the world, but the real challenge is to defend democracy, because if you're Democrats, then let's enable
mi az európai népakarat? Köszönöm.
Referenda on the EU, and let's check what the population wants.
Now, thank you. To respond, President Juncker for the Commission. President, please. Well, President, dear colleagues, it's quite true that Europe can't actually receive on its territory or all the poor people of the world, or cover all the evils of the world, but the whole of Europe has got to be involved in dealing with it. We cannot just be neutral on the sidelines doing nothing. We have to think about these sorts of things when there's more and more unfairness, injustice, serious events occurring elsewhere in this world. And it's true that we've got to fight these problems at their source, the origins of migration. Some people are doing precisely that, and I would like to thank the member states who have not reduced their aid to development. Not many of them. And I'd also like to thank those who intend to correct upwards their amount of aid to development. Well, I would like to criticize member states who have actually cut their contribution of aid to development and humanitarian aid. I would like to criticize those who have cut their food aid contributions to the food fund. I'd like to reduce member states who reduced their contribution to the running costs of the UN Refugee Agency. We've got to praise those who've done something and criticize those who've actually increased the problems and the problems of this mass of people coming to Europe. We have to be proud, though, that those who are unhappy look to Europe, because for them Europe is seen as somewhere where it's, you know, they've got a better life. Why not? Why don't they go to Russia? Why don't they go to China? Why do they not go to the United States? Why don't they go to the Gulf states? I mean, should we say, oh, terribly sorry, because of the fact that we are seen in the rest of the planet as the place where you can live best? No, we've got to manage the flow of refugees, and that's what we're doing. I think the correct response to the problem of migration is not to build walls. Refugees, these unfortunate, unhappy people, pretty much always find a way of acceding to European territory. Always. Build walls, doesn't matter, it won't resolve the problem. But those who build walls should at least be extremely careful with the language which they use as they build. You must not forget that words actually speak to those who hear. Why don't we say refugees are economic refugees without any protest? How do you know that? How do you know? There are some who leave their countries because they're persecuted. So let's not mix up the categories. Of course there are economic refugees. Would you not be one yourself if you lived in similar circumstances as they? Okay, they don't have the right to stay in Europe, but let's not talk about these unfortunate people as if they were gangsters, organized criminals. No, they're all unfortunate people. I said building walls is not the proper response. But I would also say, well, think about it. Why do some people think that they can build walls between member states of the European Union? Why, between member states of the European Union, is the wall building something which doesn't seem to worry people any longer? It's most peculiar that in 2015 some governments are building walls internally within the European wall. What does that really mean? Well, it means the end of Europe. If everybody were to do that, that would be the end of Europe. I think we have got to be quite open and just criticize people who carry out this sort of engineering. Some of you, quite a few of you, have criticised the European Union because they've not been up to the job of taking decisions. But I will say the European Council took place on 23rd of September. Parliament is going to vote the budget, which accompanies the decisions of the Council, on the 15th of October. And I know what I'm talking about here. Never in the course of history have decisions here been taken so swiftly as this time. The Council, the Commission and Parliament can actually be proud of this. If we were always as decisive and quick as we are at the moment, Europe would be in a much better state. You criticise member states. Well, yes, okay, but you always say European Union. But that's not right. Don't say Europe, European Union to me. Say member states if you like, which is true, or some member states, that's true. Can't take decisions. Don't criticise Europe, criticise member states. They are the ones who are stopping us from being able to act. And above all, don't criticise my dear friend Mr. Tusk. I have witnessed personally the events of meetings in the European Council. If some member states impede the President of the Council from going ahead with the sort of speed he would like to have for the European Council, well, okay, but don't criticise the President, who's doing everything he possibly can to make progress. Criticise properly those member states who are obstacles in this process. And we come back to a very significant thing, always. I'm very swayed by the fact that the religious factor or the philosophical factor is something which in Europe is blown up very often. You can't always say we just want Christians on our territory. You can't just say, well, you don't want other people from another faith. That is exaggerating that particular aspect. We should not be tolerant of intolerance. We should always fight intolerance. Oh, Turkey as well. I'd like to say something about Turkey. Well, how do some people arrogate unto themselves the right to say, okay, I had a coffee with Mr. Erdogan yesterday? Well, we tried very hard to get an agreement on refugees. That was tough work. It's very important, not just for Greece, but for the whole of Europe. But we also looked at other things. It wasn't just a cozy coffee. I mean, it's not as though we were holding each other's hands. No. I mean, obviously I spoke with him and the President of the Parliament as well. There are differences of opinion, but I did look to Turkey being on the list of safe countries. Some countries said, no, they shouldn't be. But if Turkey were not on the list of safe countries, imagine what would happen. Some people are arguing that way, but then if you do that, we'd have to immediately cease negotiations for accession with Turkey. Think about the consequences. Turkey relies on some help from us too, and when they negotiate with the European Union, that's a good thing. We're talking. And as long as we continue talking, Turkey will have to be on the list of safe countries. It wasn't just beautiful words we spoke to each other. I mean, we got 2.2 million refugees, remember, on Turkish territory. We looked at reality, but remember that, 2.2 million. That takes some effort. And we're looking to 130,000 people being taken on board in the spirit of solidarity here. But Turkey's got 2.2. That's the reality. Lebanon and Jordan, that's extra. Although, I mean, that's a heavy percentage. So, a little bit of looking at reality in the face does us good from time to time. We need some sort of standing system for sharing out through Europe, and we need a legalization, a system for immigration into Europe. I come from a very small country myself, from Luxembourg. You maybe don't know that, but still, I come from Luxembourg. I grew up with Italians and Portuguese, lots of Portuguese. Luxembourg is one of the richest countries in the European Union. Without the Portuguese and without the Italians, this small country would not be today what it has now become. Immigration does bring wealth. Thank you. Thank you, President Juncker. President Tusk, and I will give the chair now to Vice President Tajani.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, thank you, Jean-Claude, for your support. But of course, we are here in the Parliament to be criticized, and I am not here to be applauded. It's our job, I think, and of course we have to be tough if you want to be politicians. And I think that in this context, everything must be clear. Thank you for the discussion, and I think that after this discussion we are fully aware that this case, this issue, is still dividing Europeans, and I can understand Why? Also member states, but also here in the European Parliament. But at the same time, I feel that today the chance for having a more common approach, it's much bigger than a few weeks ago. I have no illusions and I have no doubts that, in fact, nothing in this case is easy. First of all, because the scale of this issue is bigger than ever before. And this is why it's so full of emotions, not only in this house. First of all, I would like to underline that we have now, this is the issue today, because of the scale, is absolutely unique. And this is why nothing is easy in this case, because today we are talking, in fact, about almost 70 million displaced people in the world. Almost all of them are around us, I mean in Africa and Eurasia. 70 million. We have, when it comes to, for example, to Afghans, we have almost 3 million Afghans on their way to other countries. They are today in Pakistan, in Iran, in Iraq, in Turkey, some of them already in Europe. 3 million. We have to be aware that maybe not for all of them, but for sure for majority of them, Europe is or can be the final destination. We have about 8 million displaced people in Syria. It means internally displaced. 3 million Syrians in Turkey, Jordan, and Iraq. Hundreds of thousands potential refugees from Yemen. This is why nothing is easy in this case. This is why some of us in Europe are so nervous. This is why we feel something like fear. And I can understand why, because this is something new. Refugees, this is for sure it's not a new problem. But this scale, this new exodus, this is something new. And some of member states, they have no experience with this kind of problem. This is why I think the emotions are so high. I can't agree with this thesis that majority of them, I mean of refugees, are social migrants. First of all, today it is impossible to distinguish between refugees and migrants, because in fact all of them today are escaping from war, poverty, hunger at the same time. From Afghanistan, from Syria, from other countries. And this is why I think this is the next reason why the situation is really difficult for us, because we have to treat them as a potential asylum seekers, almost all of them. Second, why nothing is easy in this case? Because this new conflict in Syria, the war in Syria, it's very possible that it can transform into global conflict because of engagement of some global powers in Syria today. And I have no doubt that the current situation is bad enough to provoke the new wave of refugees from Syria. As I mentioned in my first intervention here, the estimation is today that about 3 million of Syrian refugees are on their way today from Aleppo and the neighborhood of Aleppo. Third, the situation is also difficult because we have no convenient partners around us. We have to cooperate with other countries, I have no doubts. For example, Turkey. I know, I can fully understand why some of us are very critical or skeptical when it comes to Turkey. But on the other hand, if we want to cope with this problem, Turkey are absolutely a key partner in this project. Whether we want to lecture Turkey today, or we want Turkey to have on our board to tackle the refugees problem. And this is, for me, I know that this is a very dramatic dilemma. But today we have to solve this dilemma, and our opinion, I mean institutions, is that we have to try to cooperate with Turkey because, in fact, we have no other options today. As you know, around us we have more difficult partners than Turkey. Turkey is not easy, but for sure this is the best possible partner when it comes to our neighborhood in the south and in the east. It's obvious for me that we have to be engaged, and of course also member states. This is why I am absolutely sure that our next European Council will be also dedicated to this issue, and I hope that the discussion today here in our Parliament will be also a real inspiration for some leaders and some member states, and I'm sure that you know what I mean. Było jeszcze pytanie od...
There was also a question from the Polish Member of Parliament, Mr. Olbrycht, what we could possibly do together and what we should be doing separately as member states. And one thing is clear today. No European member state can on its own accept and support all the refugees that are coming, and that's why we need a system of relocation. At the same time, we can see that no member state on our external borders can deal with the flux of immigrants that we are witnessing. And both these issues require a common approach, and we should avoid finger pointing. And that's why we should be thinking about common European responsibility for the protection of the external border. We can see it clearly today that this extraordinary burden and responsibility exceeds any capacity of any member state. This is a revolution in our thinking to date, but I think we should go ahead with this revolution. Europe should assume part of the responsibility to protect our external borders, as well as dealing with such cases as hotspots and refugee camps, when necessary, within Europe, but also outside Europe, helping to arrange such solutions outside Europe. This is very important for all the European institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Tusk. Thank you very much, President Juncker, for your speeches, but much more for your engagement on these very difficult issues. Thank you very much. La discussione è chiusa.
That concludes the debate. According to the agenda, we've got a Council and Commission statements, humanitarian situation of refugees within the EU and neighbouring countries.
Possiamo riprendere.
Well, let's pick up this debate. And the first speaker being from the Council and for the Council, Minister Nicholas Schmidt.
Monsieur le Ministre, vous avez la parole.
You may speak, yes, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les
President, honourable members, the root causes of the refugee flows arriving into the European Union can be found in the horrendous conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and the crisis that has ravaged Afghanistan and the Horn of Africa for a long time. The decisions taken by the heads of state and government at their informal meeting on the 23rd of September confirms the European Union's strong commitment, both domestically and externally, to deal with the humanitarian difficulties arising from this crisis. But let's spell it out now. We are freeing up the requisite resources to find funding for humanitarian bodies active on the ground, such as the High Commissioner for Refugees and the World Food Programme. In this way, we hope to better tackle the needs of the refugees closer to their countries of origin. In Turkey, Jordan, Libya, Lebanon and Iraq, we will take action. We are the main donor when it comes to dealing with the interminable war facing Syria. We are looking at bolstering the trust fund so that tangible projects can be implemented. That way we will be able to help refugees in critical areas such as education and youth employment. I'm thinking of the Madad Fund here. It is underfunded, and we also have the Emergency Fund for Africa. In both cases, this is a response to a demand that was expressed by the European Parliament and the heads of state and government. Now, what are we doing within the European Union? The Council is aware of the scale of the crisis and the urgent need for an effective and rapid response to the humanitarian crisis facing the refugees, and so the Council did its utmost to tackle this problem as a top priority issue. For this reason, two extraordinary meetings of the JHA Council were convened. They took place on the 14th and 22nd of October 2015, in addition to regularly scheduled meetings planned by the Presidency. The aim was to provide follow-up to guidelines issued by the European Council at its meetings in April and June. In other words, deal with the European Agenda for Migration tabled by the Commission in May and the additional package of measures that the Commission put forward on the 9th of September. As a Minister for Employment, yesterday I organised a lunch of ministers during which we discussed the support that the European Union and the Commission might provide to countries currently dealing with the largest number of refugees to facilitate integration of the refugees and also facilitate their access to the labour market, to provide support for language classes, to assess their professional qualifications, ensure education for children, and so on and so forth. Commissioner Thyssen presented a number of ideas on how funds might be used, in particular the European Social Fund, so that we can take action in this area. The Presidency